Hey, amazing juniors. This video is actually a request from some of the things that you guys said you want to learn more about. And I tried to include as many as possible, and to the fact that I'm dividing it by A days and B days. So this is what the A days requested information on, and B day students, it's still worth listening to. Also, a lot of students requested more information on women during the revolution. So I'm going to make a whole nother video on that. I actually read over the summer a book on women and the revolution. So I have a lot of interesting and valuable stuff to share. So we had a student ask about the Liberty Tree, so that's pretty interesting. And we all know about the Liberty Tree in Boston, but by reading about what you saw in the American Revolution Museum site is that there were many Liberty trees. So the one that was from Boston was actually eventually torn down by loyalists and British soldiers, and they cut it down and used it for wood to heat their armies. Now, why were trees important? Trees actually go back to being symbolic for liberty, going back to England. It's a tradition or a custom they actually took with them. And if you think about it, the way towns were, trees would be a common meeting spot. Like, oh, meet us by the tree on the hill. Often trees were even bigger than the buildings there at the time. So it was sort of natural that they came to become meeting spots. Um, French military leader Lafayette, um, when he came to the US, one of the first things, or the colonies, I don't know what it was at that point, but one of the first things he said is how he wanted to see that Liberty Tree and where it was. Other towns that didn't have trees, they actually erected Liberty poles. And when the revolution happened a few years later in France, they actually began to name and plant their own Liberty trees, um, just sort of copying what we did. And then eventually there were even Liberty trees in Italy and Germany. So it's a trend that is not just unique to Boston. Some people, several, asked about the art of the battles. Remember, on that museum website, you can look at lots of the art, but some of the art was made years after the revolution itself. And why were they made? It was often to display pride of the nation or of certain individuals that were in the war. Artists often, or it was their job, they wanted to make money, and some of it did it just to reveal how brutal war was. Right? You could not watch a movie, or people didn't have cell phones to record the brutality of war. So these paintings conveyed that, and this is an example of one of those paintings by John Trumbull. And notice this is a good few years after the war that this was even made. Phyllis Wheatley, I don't know why I have the apostrophe S. She's someone we should learn some more about. She was a woman in Massachusetts, I believe, and she was a slave, but the family where she was taught her to read and write and encouraged her education. And she became a well-known writer and a poet. And she did support the Continental cause. And she admired George Washington and even wrote a famous work, a famous poem praising him. But even though she supported the Continental's cause, she also supported the ending of slavery. And she's like, you know what, if you really want to fight this cause correctly, if you really want to be heroes, you need to end slavery as well. But a fascinating individual to learn more about. So, thinking about slaves and the revolution, people asked about that as well. Now, you guys did note, in many groups who did Valley Forge, how the Valley Forge troops were actually not segregated. And that was true, but not all of the people who were there, some of those people who were integrated were slaves themselves. They weren't free. Washington actually did not want slaves or former slaves or even free blacks serving in his military. Ironically, 2 days after he made this announcement, some black soldiers fought for the British on the Virginia coast, sort of showing that their potential and how they can fight. So the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, actually said, if you escape and you fight for us, you will be granted freedom. And it's not because the British were so noble, and it's not because they were abolitionists. It's more because of military strategy. What it did is it weakened the Virginians because they didn't have their main source of labor anymore. Who was going to tend to the fields and do their work if the slaves were not there? So that was actually expanded in 1779 by the Philipsburg Proclamation, which says all these slaves, if you leave and within all the colonies, will offer you protection. Now, about 20,000 um, blacks served the British in the Revolutionary War, as opposed to 5,000 who found ways to support and serve the Continentals, even though they weren't supposed to. But what happened, unfortunately, once the war ended, this overwhelming, freedoms did not come to the British, or was not given by the British to those who served them. Many of them went to Nova Scotia, up in Canada. Right, they couldn't stay in the colonies because slavery was still a thing in the United States. Some went and returned to, I didn't say return, but went to London or other parts of England. Some went to Africa and set up the colony, which is now known as Sierra Leone, but many of them never actually received the freedoms that they fought for, unfortunately. So a student asked for firsthand accounts of the Lexington and Concord, and there are many, but here's a few. So this is the first one by a lieutenant of the King's Own, means he was British, right? And you see what he says: between 10 and 11 o'clock, all the grenadiers and light infantry of the army embarked and were landed upon the opposite shore on Cambridge Marsh. Few but the commanding officers knew what expedition we were going on. After getting over the marsh, we were wet up to the knees. We were halted in a dirty road and stood there for a long time waiting for provisions, that's like food, to be brought from the boats and to be divided, and in which most of the men threw away, having carried some with them. So that's like what it was like before it started. Here's this tale from a corporal. This is a bit more graphic, I guess. After I had fired the first time, I retreated about 10 rods and then loaded my gun a second time with 2 balls, and on firing at the British, the strength of the charge took off about a foot of my gun barrel. So that's not good, right? Such was the general confusion and so much firing on the part of the British that it was impossible for me to know the number of our men who fired immediately on receiving the second fire from the British troops, but that some of them fired, besides Ebenezer Monroe and myself, I am very confident. The regulars kept up a fire in all directions as long as they could see a man of our company in arms. Isaac Muzzy, Jonathan Harrington, and my father, Robert Monroe, near the place where our line was formed. Samuel Hadley and John Brown were killed after they had gotten off the common. Asa Hull Porter of Woburn, who had been taken a prisoner by the British on their march to Lexington, attempted to make his escape and was shot within a few rods of the common. Caleb Harrington was shot down on attempting to leave the meeting house, where he and some others had gone, before the British soldiers came up for the purpose of removing a quantity of powder that was stored there. So this is before the war was even officially starting, remember? You can see it, right? How serious it was to be involved with that. Several students asked about weapons, so I'm going to include some here, and I'll also include more in the subsequent video. And some also asked about the cannons outside the museum, and I could not find information, but I am on a hunt and I will find that out. So the one in the top right is a standard type of rifle that was made at the Virginia State Gun Factory. It was also known as the Fredericksburg Gun Factory, and I think like the Public Gun Factory. There's like 3 names for it. And it was a type of musket. Below you see the Brown Bess and its bayonet that was often attached to it. Now this was a British weapon, but used by American colonists, and that's sort of ironic itself too, like fighting against a country with weapons made from them, which is not the only time in history that that's happened. The American Turtle was the first submarine used in warfare, but it looks nothing like submarines today, as you can see in that drawing. And this was from September 7th, 1776. They attempted to attach a bomb to the hull of a British ship, the Eagle, which was in the New York harbor. And the submarine was first built in, how many people think of this? In the early 1600s, the first submarines were actually built by the Dutch. But an American inventor, David Bushnell, began building underwater mines and sort of figuring out how to attach them to these submarines. So the Turtle was an 8-foot long wooden submarine that actually used hand power, right? So like you literally basically were like turning a crank. Only one person could stay in it. And there was lead to help keep it balanced, right? So completely unlike a submarine of today. And this man, Ezra Lee, piloted this, and he got close to the Eagle. He could see up and actually see the British looking down off the deck at his submarine, but I don't think they could see what exactly it was. And long story short, he's not able to attach the mine. And it did explode later, but no one got hurt. And so the whole mission was ineffective, but it still was an important milestone. Others asked about the Bunker Hill Bible, which you can see at the museum, and it's one of two Bibles that were known to be at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and they acquired it for like $161,000. And one of the directors at the museum said it provides an incredible opportunity to showcase the role that religious faith played in sustaining those who were involved in the American Revolution. Now, one of your classmates remarked that they thought it was amazing. They didn't think so many soldiers carried Bibles. And in the Revolutionary War, not many of them did. It started to become a thing towards the end of the Revolution. And there was a company basically that tried to print some out for them. Mostly it was made for Protestants. That was the majority of the troops. They did try to make Catholic versions and Jewish scriptures as well. But this is nothing new. Even back in the 1600s in England, they called pocket Bibles that they made like little, it wasn't the entire Bible, but little parts of Bibles that people could literally carry on their uniform. And it's still a common practice for different types of religious works to be given to people in the military in America today. Oh, my image didn't come out. But trade and illegal behavior, yes, pirates were a thing. You don't learn about them much, but the harsh measures that the British enforced on the colonies, which we already learned about, encouraged the colonies, even the colonial governors encouraged them to trade illegally and actually negotiate with pirates. So von Steuben is someone I think some people who did maybe Valley Forge mentioned him. A very interesting figure. Now, he was Prussian, so today we would say he was German, but back then it was Prussia was its own state. So he did work for the Continental Army as an inspector general. He was a major general and eventually a member of Washington's like inner circle and was his chief of staff. So what he's most famous for is bringing military drills, tactics, and discipline to the Patriots. So many of us learned already that when these Continental soldiers first enlisted, a lot of them had no military background. A lot of them were just sort of ragtag and lacked the discipline and to succeed. And that a lot of soldiers were dying from not from battle, but from disease. And so he tried to change this in a few ways, having lots of drills. And also, for those of you who remarked, like all the rows at Valley Forge, he's the one behind that. He brought order to it in order to include make hygiene more of an issue. He said the kitchen should be in one side of where, what do you call that, not a battle but an area, and your latrine where you use the bathroom should be in another end, and that where the latrine is, everything should run off downhill, like away from where you guys are. So every night what he did is he wrote out the drills the next day in German. He only spoke a little bit of English. German was the military language of Europe at the time. Prussians were known as one of the best fighting forces there were. So he wrote it in German. And then he had a secretary who knew German and French. So he wrote it from German to French. And then Washington had a secretary that knew French and English. So then it went from French to English. And that's how the chain of how it worked. And he worked very closely with Hamilton and Nathaniel Greene. Is that it for today? All right, well, that's it for today. Part 2 will be coming up shortly.